Welcome back to Eagle Eye Apache. Today, I want to share a story that has stayed with me. A story of a young woman who carried quiet strength in a world that sought to break her. It is a story of fear, flight, and the first flicker of freedom. Her name was Clara Whitfield, and she was only 18. The camp where she lived was called Hollow Creek. It wasn't much more than a blister of tents, 2 cabins leaning against the wind, and a chapel so weather-warped it looked like it might fall with the next storm. A place built on men's hunger for gold and women's silence. Clara had learned long ago how to disappear in plain sight. She kept her voice low, her head bowed, her hands always busy. She cooked, swept, hauled water, anything to keep from drawing the wrong kind of attention. She knew better than to hold a man's gaze for too long. To survive in Hollow Creek was to make yourself useful and invisible. Her mother had died when Clara was still a child, leaving her in the care of Martin Hale. He called himself her stepfather. But to Clara, he felt more like a debt collector, a man of cheap whiskey, small lies, and even smaller courage. He dragged her west, chasing fortune, but found only failure, and the bitterness of a man who believes the world owes him more than it ever will. That winter, the sky hung low over Hollow Creek, the color of bruises. Smoke from pine fires stung the air, and the wind carried a bite sharp as regret. Clara rose before dawn to sweep the chapel tent. Her shawl pulled tight against the cold. She thought it would be another day like all the rest. She was wrong. From behind the cookhouse, she caught sight of Martin speaking with Jonas Mercer, the mine foreman. Mercer was tall, broad-shouldered, and hard in the way only men who never hear no can be. His black coat whipped in the wind as he leaned close to Martin. Clara couldn't hear every word, but she saw enough: the crooked smile on Mercer's lips, the way Martin's eyes slid away, too ashamed to meet his gaze. Something inside Clara went cold. Later, Martin found her hauling wood. He didn't shout. He never needed to. His voice, when low and rough, was worse than anger. "Put on your blue dress," he told her, without looking her way. Her hands froze on the woodpile. Why, he turned, gray eyes flat. "Don't ask me that again. Wash your face. Tee your hair back proper. We've got company tonight." Her stomach twisted, but she obeyed. She had always obeyed. That evening, inside the supply tent, heavy with smoke and oil lamp shadows, Jonas Mercer sipped brandy and looked at her as if she were an object up for sale. "You're a quiet little thing," he said, smiling like a snake. "That's good. A man needs quiet when he comes home." Martin sat with his hands clasped, eyes fixed on the ground. He didn't touch the drink Mercer poured him. He didn't speak a word in her defense. When Mercer mentioned timber rights that Martin held, the trade was sealed without another breath. Clara's throat closed. The blue dress itched at her neck. Her mother had stitched it years ago, back when there was still music in their home, back when laughter still existed. Now it was nothing but a costume for her own betrayal. That night, after the camp had gone still, Clara returned to the bunkhouse. The other women slept, but sleep would not come for her. She sat in the dark, clutching her mother's locket, worn thin by years of worry. She thought of her mother's voice, soft, steady, telling her once that there was always a choice, even when the world tried to convince her otherwise. And in that silence, Clara understood if she stayed, she would be sold. So she chose. She gathered what little she owned: a torn shawl, a small, knife, her mother's locket, and bound them in a cloth bundle. Her hands shook, not from the cold, but from the enormity of what she was about to do. Then she slipped out into the night. Snow crunched beneath her boots as she moved between the tents, keeping to the shadows. Every breath came white in the frozen air. The wind clawed at her dress, and the cold bit through in minutes. But she pressed on, past the edge of camp. The forest rose black and silent, spruce trees crowding the trail. She followed an old game path east, climbing higher toward the ridgeline. The night owls called once, then fell silent. Somewhere, a fox watched her and vanished. Clara's fingers burned with cold. Her lips split. She wanted to stop, to rest. But she knew if she did, she might never rise again. She forced herself forward until she found a hollow at the base of a boulder, half sheltered from the wind, crawling inside. She curled tight, knees against her chest, clutching the locket close. She didn't pray, not exactly, but she whispered her mother's name once, like a promise. Then, sleep came, a dangerous, heavy sleep, the kind that feels like falling through snow slow, endless, silent, and far above, where the ridge opened wide to the white wilderness, someone watched. He did not move at first. He stood still as stone, boots sunk deep in snow, eyes dark and sharp. His hair was bound with a strip of leather, and across his shoulder rested a hunter's bow. His name was Daniel Lone Elk. He had seen countless tracks in snow before, but never any like hers. These were the footprints of desperation. A girl running not from hunger, not from wolves, but from men. And when he saw the locket clutched in her frozen hands, with its thread tied in the Apache knot of remembrance, he knew this was no accident. The fire of memory had found her, and he would not walk away. Clara moved quickly through the trees, her breath breaking in sharp, white clouds. Each step crunched against the frozen earth, loud in her own ears. Though the camp behind her remained silent, she did not dare look back. To turn her head even once might summon Martin's voice, Jonas Mercer's hand, the trap closing tighter. So she kept her eyes forward, heart thundering, every beat a prayer that her footsteps would not be followed. The night was merciless. Snow fell sideways, carried on a wind that cut through her blue dress as though it were made of paper. The shawl she clutched at her shoulders stiffened with frost. Her hands burned first with pain, then with the frightening numbness that meant frostbite was close. Still, she pressed forward, better to face the storm than the men she had left behind. The forest swallowed her. Black spruce crowded close, their branches heavy with ice, their needles whispering against one another in the restless wind. The moon broke through clouds now and then, throwing pale silver over the trail. But even that comfort was fleeting. Mostly, there was only darkness, and the sound of her own breath, rasping fast and shallow. At last her body betrayed her. Her knees buckled, sending her sprawling into the snow. For a moment, she simply lay there, cheek pressed against the frozen ground, her lungs heaving. Tears stung her eyes, not from grief, but from the raw bite of the wind. But she would not stop. She could not. With shaking fingers, she pulled the small bundle close to her chest and forced herself upright. She stumbled forward again until she reached the shadow of a boulder jutting from the hillside. At its base, where wind had carved a shallow hollow, she crawled inside. There she curled tight, pulling her knees to her chest. She clutched her mother's locket in one hand. So cold, it burned her skin. Her teeth rattled against one another, and her breath came in short, painful gasps. She closed her eyes and whispered her mother's name, one word. Half a prayer, half a plea. Sleep crept over her like snow falling heavy on branches. Slow, silent, and almost sweet. Her body sagged against the stone. Her hands slackened. The locket slipped, swinging on its thin chain. The red thread tied through it, catching the firelight of the moon. And far above her, on the ridge where the trees thinned and the world stretched into a white horizon, a man watched. His name was Daniel Lone Elk, tall and broad-shouldered. His form blended with the forest buckskin cloak, bow slung across his back, dark hair bound with a strip of rawhide. His eyes were sharp, used to reading every mark the land left behind. He had seen thousands of footprints across snow in his life, deer hooves, fox paws, the dragging trails of rabbits. He knew each one by shape, weight, and depth. But these prints were different. Small, uneven, staggering. The prints of a girl running not towards something, but away. He followed them with patience, step by step, until he reached the boulder where she had fallen. He did not move closer at first. He stood still, his breath misting in the night air, eyes locked on the figure, huddled in the hollow. She was shaking with cold, nearly gone, her lips pale as ash. Yet in her frozen hand, he saw something that stopped him where he stood. The locket, worn brass, simple in shape, but tied with a loop of red thread, knotted in a way he knew as well as his own name. His grandmother had tied thread like that once, years ago, when the tribe whispered the names of those taken or lost, a thread bound not for beauty, but for memory, a promise that those carried away by silence would not be forgotten. Daniel's chest tightened. This girl, this stranger, carried the knot of his people. He could not know how or why, but he understood one thing: such things did not happen by chance. The storm howled through the ridge, scattering powder over his boots. The forest creaked beneath its weight. He glanced once toward the camp below, the dim orange glow of fires still burning in the hollow. Then he looked back at the girl, Clara Whitfield. Though he did not know her name yet, he knew the choice before him: walk away, leave her to the cold, let her story end in silence, or step forward and alter both of their fates forever. Daniel Lone Elk did not move immediately. He stood as if testing the weight of the night, listening to the snow, listening to the pull of memory, and then, with slow certainty, he descended the slope toward her. When Clara stirred again, it was not to the scream of the storm, but to the crackle of fire. Warmth, faint but real, reached her skin. Her lashes fluttered open, and the world above her swam into focus, a low ceiling of rough-cut logs, shadows trembling across it, smoke trailing toward a vent in the roof. Beneath her cheek was fur, real fur, thick and musky. For a moment, she thought she must be dreaming, that the snow had carried her away into some strange afterlife. Then she felt the ache in her limbs, the sting of her lips, the dull burn in her feet. Not death life. Pain meant life. A voice came, low but steady. Don't move too fast. Her heart thudded sharp against her ribs. She turned her head and saw him, the man from the ridge, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in layers of buckskin and wool. his black hair tied back with rawhide. His eyes were dark, unreadable, and when they met hers, they did not soften, but neither did they carry the hunger she had come to dread from men. His gaze was steady, but not invasive. "You need rest," he said. Clara tried to speak, but her throat was too dry. She swallowed, licked her cracked lips, and forced out the faintest word. Who are you?" He crouched by the fire, adding a stick of wood to the coals. His voice came rough, like bark stripped from an old tree. "Daniel. Daniel Lone Elk." The name settled in the air like smoke, solid and unshakable. He reached for a tin cup near the flames, poured warm water into it, and held it out to her. Clara's hands trembled as she took it, the heat stinging her palms. She drank slowly, careful not to spill, every swallow easing the desert dryness in her throat. When the cup was empty, he rose and moved toward the far wall, where bundles of herbs and dried meat hung from wooden pegs. His steps were silent, as if even the lodge itself recognized his presence. Clara pushed herself upright, blinking hard. That was when she noticed her boots were gone, her feet wrapped in soft cloth strips that smelled faintly of cedar. Panic surged. She clutched the blanket tighter around her legs. He seemed to sense her fear without her speaking it. "Frostbite," he said simply. "Would have taken half your toes if I left you." She stared at him, unsure whether to trust his bluntness. But the truth sat heavy in her bones. He had not harmed her. He had kept her alive. "Where am I?" she whispered. He glanced back. High ridge, south face. "The storm came last night. You would have died out there." Her pride prickled. She wanted to argue, to say she might have made it. But every bruise and cut on her body knew otherwise. She lowered her eyes to the fire. "Why? Why did you help me?" Daniel turned then, crouching in front of her. In his hand was something small, her mother's locket. "This was around your neck," he said, holding it out. Clara's breath caught. She reached for it, clutching it tight against her chest. The red thread looped through the chain glowed faintly in the firelight. "You know what that knot means?" he asked. She shook her head. "It was my mother's. She never explained, only tied it this way. Said it helped her remember." Daniel's gaze darkened. Not with anger, but with recognition. "My grandmother tied thread like this. For those taken, for those lost. A promise that silence would not have the last word." The fire snapped once, sending sparks up the chimney hole. Clara turned the locket in her hand, the thread rough beneath her fingers. "My mother, she died when I was 10. She never spoke of where she came from, only sang songs I didn't understand." Daniel studied her face. For a long time he said nothing. Then, finally, his voice dropped lower, almost a murmur. "Maybe she wanted you to remember without words." Clara swallowed hard. The thought sent a strange warmth through her chest. A mix of grief and something else, hope. Silence lingered between them. The storm outside had not passed. Wind howled against the logs. Snow hissed across the roof. Yet inside the lodge, the fire burned steady. "You'll need to stay until it clears," Daniel said, standing again. 2 days, maybe 3. Clara nodded faintly. She tightened the blanket around herself. Gratitude mingled with unease. In her world, nothing came freely. And yet here she sat, alive, because a stranger had chosen not to walk away. As the night deepened, she lay back against the furs. Watching him move about the shelter, he spoke little, only the necessary words. He stirred a pot of stew with slow precision, carved strips of hide, arranged herbs in bundles. His life was one of silence and survival. And she realized he was a man who needed nothing. And still, he had not left her in the snow before sleep claimed her again. Clara whispered into the hush, barely loud enough for him to hear. "Why do you live out here alone?" For the first time, he looked directly at her. His expression unreadable. "Same reason you ran," he said. "Some places ain't safe for people like us." The fire popped, the wind wailed, and Clara closed her eyes. For the first time in years, even with fear still clinging to her bone, she felt something unfamiliar. Something fragile. She felt safe. The storm did not pass quickly. It pressed against the lodge with all its weight. Wind screaming through the pines. Snow clawing at the door curtain. Days in such weather could stretch into a lifetime. But inside, time began to move differently. Clara woke to the scent of smoke and meat simmering with herbs. Daniel had already been at work. His movements spare, deliberate. He did not waste words. He did not waste effort. Each gesture seemed carved out of necessity. That morning, when she reached for the pot to stir, he watched her closely. "Not yet," he said. "You stir too soon. You burn the bottom." She pulled her hand back, half embarrassed. "Then, show me how." So he did, patiently. He placed the flat stone in her hands, gave her wild tubers to cut. His rough fingers brushed hers only once, correcting the angle of the knife. No more than that. His distance was respect. And it startled her, because respect was not a language she had been spoken to in years. They worked side by side in silence, until the stew bubbled rich with flavor. Rabbit meat, tubers, wild carrot, and the bitter tang of a green plant she did not recognize. When she asked, he told her its name, though his voice carried no pride, only the weight of memory. Later, Daniel showed her the jars he kept tucked onto shelves carved into the stone wall. Inside were bundles of dried leaves, roots, powders. He held one jar out to her. Its clay, marked with a streak of red ochre. "For fevers," he said, showing her a curled root. He pointed to another. "For pain," he pressed his knuckle gently against a piece of bark. "This one, for bleeding. You remember these. They remember you back." Clara repeated each name softly, determined not to forget. She had never been taught that the earth itself could be medicine, that memory lived in roots and leaves. When she grew tired, Daniel set aside his knife and reached for a small pouch tied with leather. Inside was a powder of gray ash, fragrant with cedar. He pinched some between his fingers and sprinkled it across the fire. Flames flared gold, then steadied into a deeper red. Clara's breath caught. "What is that?" he answered after a pause. "Spirit ash, burned cedar, herbs, sometimes pieces of our dead. It is ceremony. It is memory. Fire does not lie. It remembers what we place inside it." Clara stared at the coals, glowing steady, as though they had taken something sacred into themselves. She thought of the locket pressed to her chest, of the red thread her mother had tied without explanation. A knot she now understood was older than anything her mother ever confessed. And then came the memory, sharp as if it had waited in the shadows. For this moment, her mother at the hearth in Kansas, stirring a pot and humming softly. The tune was not English, not him, not anything she could name. She remembered asking, once, "What does it mean?" Her mother had only smiled sadly and said, "Old things, now," with the fire whispering before her. Clara hummed those same bars. Halting and uncertain, the melody rose in the lodge. Fragile as smoke, Daniel froze. His eyes lifted from the carving in his hands. He did not smile, but his gaze grew far away, as though pulled across years. When the last note faded, he spoke. "My aunt sang that. And my mother too." Clara's lips parted. "You know it." He nodded slowly. "Apache. An old song. Not all words survive. But the memory does." The room seemed to hold its breath. Snow moaned against the walls. But inside, there was only silence. Only the weight of discovery pressing between them. "My mother," Clara whispered. "She never told me. She never said she was Apache. But what if she was?" Daniel studied her for a long time. "Blood carries what words forget," he said. "Songs don't pass by accident." Clara clutched her locket tighter, her throat tightening with something between sorrow and wonder. For years she had felt rootless, unseen, as though her life was nothing but silence and survival. But now she glimpsed a thread tying her to something larger: songs, knots, fire, memory, and Daniel's presence made that thread visible. That night, as the storm deepened outside, Clara sat close to the fire. She watched Daniel carve antler into small tokens, his hands steady, every stroke purposeful. He said little, but his silence no longer felt like distance. It felt like invitation. When she grew bold enough, she whispered, "Why do you trust me?" He didn't look up. His answer was slow. "I don't." Clara's heart stumbled. She lowered her gaze, ashamed. But then, after a long pause, he added, "You don't lie. Not to me. That counts for something." The words settled over her heavier than the furs she lay beneath. For years she had been small, obedient, unseen. And now here, in this lodge, in the eye of a storm, someone had looked at her and spoken truth instead of demand. The fire burned low. Outside, snow kept falling, but inside, something else stirred. Not trust yet, not safety, something quieter, more fragile. The first flicker of belonging. The storm raged for 2 more days. But inside the lodge, the fire never died. It was their anchor, flickering low when sleep pressed heavy, flaring bright when Daniel fed it with pine or cedar. Clara found herself watching the flames as though they carried the shape of her own heartbeat, rising and falling, never steady, never still. That night, Daniel sat cross-legged by the fire, a strip of wood in his hands, carving slowly with the edge of his knife. He had spoken little since morning, but Clara had grown used to his silences. They were not cruel, not dismissive. They were a language of their own. Clara drew the blanket tighter around her shoulders and spoke before fear could stop her. "When I lived in the camp," she began, her voice thin, "I learned the only way to survive was to be small, to do what I was told, to keep my head down and never speak unless asked. I thought obedience would keep me safe, but it only made me invisible." The admission felt like fire against her throat. She half expected him to ignore her words, or worse, to confirm them. Instead, Daniel set down the piece of wood and looked at her fully. His dark eyes did not flinch, did not slide away. They held hers steady until she almost couldn't bear it. "You didn't beg," he said at last, his voice rough but certain. You burned. The words struck deep. Clara's lips parted. But no sound came. Burned. No one had ever said such a thing to her. No one had ever looked past her silence and seen something fierce still alive inside her. Her throat tightened. But she forced herself to ask, "Is that what you saw in me, fire?" Daniel's gaze did not soften, but it deepened, as though he weighed every truth before offering it. "When I first saw you in the snow, I thought you were already gone. But you clutched that locket like it was a flame, even frozen. You were still holding on. Fire remembers. And you?" He paused, his jaw tightening. "You refused to go out him." Clara pressed a hand to the locket at her chest. She wanted to believe him. Part of her still felt like the frightened girl who had crept from the camp, trembling with every step. But another part, the part that whispered her mother's songs into the fire, knew his words carried weight. She leaned forward, her voice low. "I don't know who I am anymore. Not the girl I was before my mother died. Not the one I became under Martin's shadow. And now, I'm something in between." Daniel studied her, his silence longer than before. Then he spoke in a tone softer than she had yet heard from him. "You're not in between. You're becoming." The fire popped, sending a spark up the chimney. For a long moment neither of them moved. Clara felt her pulse quicken, not from fear, but from a strange, unsteady hope. She had spent years shrinking herself, making her soul smaller just to survive. And now, here was a man telling her that she was more than survival, that she was becoming. Daniel turned back to his carving, but his voice lingered in the air. "When you look at me," he said quietly, "I forget how long I've been alone. I forget why I chose it." Clara's breath caught. She wrapped the blanket tighter around her shoulders, not against cold, but against the storm inside her chest. "What do you mean?" she asked. His hands paused over the knife, his knuckles steady. He did not lift his eyes, but his words carried the weight of confession. "I mean, I've lived with ghosts so long, I thought I was one of them. But when you sit by the fire and look at me like I'm not a shadow, I remember I'm still here. Alive." The lodge grew impossibly quiet. Clara could hear the wind rattling the pines, the hiss of snow on the roof, the steady crackle of fire. She could hear her own heartbeat, racing, unsteady. For years she had feared men, feared their hunger, their demands, to their hands. But Daniel's presence was different. His silence was different. It did not consume her. It gave her space to breathe, to remember, to exist. Slowly, she whispered, "Then maybe you were never meant to live as a ghost." He looked up, and in his eyes she saw not softness, but something rarer truth. It burned as fiercely as the flames between them. They did not touch. They did not need to. The space between them held more than hands could ever carry. In that silence, heavy with memory and fragile hope, their bond deepened. Clara leaned back against the wooden wall, her eyes fluttering shut. For the first time, she did not feel small. She did not feel invisible. She felt seen. And beside the fire, Daniel Lone Elk sat in his silence, carving not just wood, but a place where two lives once broken, once wandering, began to shape something new. The storm had broken, but the silence it left behind was heavier than the snow. Morning light bled pale and cold across the ridge, glinting off branches and frozen pools. Clara rose early to gather kindling near the spring, her breath curling into the air, her steps light on the crust of ice. Daniel was mending the roofline with strips of rawhide, his movements quiet, measured. Then the sound came low, distant, rhythmic, hoofbeats. Daniel froze. One hand braced against the logs. Clara turned, her eyes narrowing. The sound grew louder, steady and deliberate. Whoever came rode with confidence, not caution. 3 horses appeared through the trees, their riders cloaked in dust-stained coats. One man led on a black gelding, lean-faced and cruel, a shotgun resting lazily across his lap. Another rode close behind, heavier in frame, revolvers at his hips. The last man walked beside his horse, his gait unmistakable to Clara, even before his face came clear. Martin Hale. Her throat went dry. He looked thinner, worn by drink and failure. But his eyes carried the same emptiness, hollow, desperate, dangerous. He had not come to plead. He had come to reclaim. The riders dismounted. The lean man, clearly their mouthpiece, stepped forward. His voice carried with false ease. "Anyone in there, I suggest you come talk. We're looking for a girl, Clara Whitfield. Blonde hair. About so tall." He gestured lazily with his hand. "Ran off from her lawful family. We're here to bring her home." From inside the shelter, Clara clutched her locket until the chain bit into her skin. Daniel stood by the doorway, arms crossed, silent. Martin stepped forward then, his voice rough as dry rope. "She's my daughter. Ain't nobody's business but mine." Daniel's expression did not change. He stepped outside, standing tall against the pale light. His words came calm, steady, and low. "She's not yours," the mouthpiece chuckled, tilting his head. "You the Indian keeping her warm." Daniel did not blink. "She came here free. She stays free." Martin's jaw twitched, shame flickering through his eyes. "She belongs with family." Daniel took one step closer, his voice sharpened like steel pulled from the fire. "You sold her." The truth hung in the air like smoke. Martin shifted, his mouth opening, closing. He muttered, "It was a mistake. We've come to fix it." The third man began to circle wide, hand resting on his pistol. Daniel didn't watch him. He didn't need to. His focus stayed fixed on the leader's eyes. "Turn around," Daniel said. "Go back down the mountain." The mouthpiece smirked, trying to wear confidence like armor. "And if we don't?" Daniel's voice did not rise. It cut the air, low and final. "Then you'll learn what the fire remembers." Before the man could answer, the forest shifted. From the shadows of the pines, figures emerged, silent, sure-footed. An old woman with snow-white braids, wrapped in elk hide, a bow drawn in her steady hands. Behind her, 2 hunters with sharp eyes. A boy, no older than 12, clutching a slingshot carved with feathers. More followed. Not an army, but enough. They did not shout, did not threaten. They stood with the weight of the land itself. Unyielding, the lead rider swore under his breath. "Damn ghosts coming out of the trees," Martin faltered, stepping back. His face wavered between anger and fear. But he said nothing. Daniel did not turn his head. His voice carried backward, even and clear. "Clara," her heart pounded. But she stepped forward, out of the lodge and into the pale morning. Her face was pale, but her chin lifted high. She held her locket in both hands, the red thread bright against her skin. The mouthpiece looked her over, his voice thick with disdain. You sure you want to stay out here? Girl, ain't no law protects you in these woods. Clara's voice cut back, trembling, but fierce. You're right. No law does. But memory does. My mother's blood does. And I will never be yours again. Martin's lip curled. She was mine, your mother. And you too. Clara's eyes hardened. No. She was never yours. And neither was I. The old woman stepped forward, her voice carrying like wind through rock. She is blood. She carries the ash. She remembers the songs. Silence followed. Heavy. Absolute. The mouthpiece spat into the snow. Keep her. Then, ain't worth the powder. He mounted his horse, circling it back toward the trail. Come on. Hail. Your girl's gone. Martin hesitated, eyes flicking to Clara one last time. For a breath? The past wavered between them, years of silence, fear, and debt. But Clara did not flinch. She did not bow her head. She held his gaze until, finally, he turned away. The riders disappeared into the trees, their hoofbeats fading down the ridge. Only when the silence returned did Daniel exhale, slow and low. The old woman laid a hand on Clara's shoulder. You did not run, she said. That is what matters. Clara felt her knees shake, but she stood her ground. For the first time in her life, she had not hidden. She had not obeyed. She had stood. That night, the fire burned brighter than it had all winter, not for warmth, not for fear, but for ceremony. And Clara Whitfield, once invisible, once sold, now stood in the circle of memory, her place no longer in question. Spring did not rush to the mountains. It came quietly, as if testing whether the land would allow it. Snow thinned first along the lower trails, revealing dark earth and brittle grass. Pine needles lay scattered where the wind had stripped them bare. Yet even in this hesitant season, a fire was lit in the clearing near the hot spring. A fire not for warmth, but for remembrance. Clara stood at the edge of that circle, her breath shallow, her heart steady but unsteady all at once. She wore a simple tunic dyed with clay and ash, its seams stitched by women who had asked her nothing but her hands. Around her neck hung the carving Daniel had given her, a flame of antler, polished, smooth. In her hair, 2 braids laced with red thread. The villagers gathered, few in number, but strong in presence. Elders with lines like riverbeds across their faces. Children with berry-stained lips and curious eyes. Hunters. Women. The old and the young, each carrying something in their hands. Herbs, bark, carved stones, small offerings laid gently by the fire. At the center stood Sonny, the white-braided elder whose voice had carried the truth. The morning Martin Hale turned away, her palms lifted toward the sky, fingers spread like wings. When she spoke, her voice was low, steady, and strong. Today we name what has returned. Many forget what blood carries. They think paper is stronger. They think names louder. But memory remembers. And fire remembers. She turned toward Clara. The crowd was silent, the wind still, as though the mountain itself listened. From a pouch, Sonny drew a shawl, dyed in warm tones of earth and sky. In its center, a flame had been stitched with orange thread, ringed by pine boughs. The ridge holds memory. Sonny said, the fire holds truth. And she the shawl lowered across Clara's shoulders. Heavy, fragrant with cedar, holds both. A hush spread over the circle. Then Sunny spoke the word. Ayana. The name rose into the air like smoke. Ayana. Some said it meant eternal blossom. Others, she who stays. Both were true. Clara swallowed hard, her chest tight. Slowly, she whispered it herself, tasting the sound. Ayana. The villagers murmured in acceptance, not with clapping or cheer, but with nods, with the soft beat of drums, with voices humming low. A song grew from them, old and steady, weaving through the trees. A boy no older than 5 stepped forward shyly, offering her a bundle of pine needles wrapped in cloth. His hands trembled as he held it out, but his eyes shone with trust. She bent to take it, her fingers brushing his small ones. He smiled once, quick and fleeting, then darted back to his place. Children gathered near her after the song faded, their faces lifted, waiting, and without thinking. Clara, no. Ayana opened her mouth and began to hum. The same melody her mother had once carried through their cabin. The same one Daniel had recognized in the firelit lodge. The notes wavered at first, fragile as a bird taking flight. Then steadier, stronger. The children leaned in close, wide-eyed, some swaying gently, some already echoing the tune with their own voices. Ayana smiled through the ache in her throat. For years, the song had been a mystery locked in memory. Now, it was alive again, carried forward, no longer hers alone. Daniel watched from the edge of the circle, silent as ever. His dark eyes followed her, but he did not step forward. He didn't need to. He had brought her this far, and now the fire itself had claimed her. When the last notes faded into the evening, Ayana felt a stillness inside her she had never known before. She was not the frightened girl in the blue dress. She was not the invisible shadow of Hollow Creek. She was Ayana, named, remembered, belonging. For the first time in her life, she no longer carried the weight of being unwanted. She carried the weight of a name, and it was enough. Spring did not arrive in the mountains all at once. It crept in, soft and cautious. As though asking permission, snow melted first along the lower trails, revealing patches of dark soil where green shoots pressed upward. The air no longer bit like iron. It carried the faint sweetness of thawing earth and cedar sap. Ayana walked barefoot across the damp ground, her hands filled with wild mint and sprigs of cedar. She had learned to name each plant, to listen for the stories they carried. Her steps were steady, sure, no longer a runaway trembling at shadows. She had become a woman who chose to stay. At the clearing near the hot spring, she knelt to wash the herbs in the warm water, steam rising into the cool air. The shawl gifted to her by the elders rested on her shoulders, its orange flame stitched at the center. She carried it not as a burden, but as a sign of memory. Ayana, the one who stayed, that evening, when the fire burned low outside Sani's lodge, Daniel came to her. He carried something wrapped in a strip of leather, folded with care. His face, as always, revealed little, but his eyes held a steadiness she had come to know as truth. He placed the bundle in her hands. For you. She opened it carefully. Inside lay a bracelet of carved bone beads, polished, smooth, and strung between turquoise and cedar. One bead bore the shape of a flame, etched with deliberate care. Her breath caught. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Daniel nodded once. "Fire remembers, and so will you." Her fingers closed over the bracelet, the weight of it pressing deep into her palm. For years, she had carried only her mother's locket, a symbol of loss and silence. Now, she held something new, something born not of what was taken, but of what had been given back. She lifted her gaze to him, her throat tight. "I don't know what I did to deserve this. You stayed," he answered simply. The fire popped, sparks rising into the night sky. For a long while they stood in silence, the mountain breathing around them, the stars blinking awake. Then Ayana whispered, almost to herself, "I was never rescued. Was I?" Daniel's eyes did not leave hers. "No. You returned." And in that moment, she understood. She had not been saved like some fragile thing carried away from danger. She had chosen, endured, stood her ground. She had claimed her own life, and in return had been given more than survival. She had been given belonging. She had been given love. Closing reflection. She had not been rescued. She had returned. In the mountains, among the Apache, Clara Whitfield became Ayana. She found not just shelter from the storm, but a place where memory lived, where fire remembered, and where a name was hers to keep. And now, dear listener, I want to ask you, if you were in her place, would you have risked everything to flee like Clara, or endured the life chosen for you? Share your thoughts below in the comments. And if this story touched your heart, please give it a like, share it with someone you know, and subscribe to Eagle Eye Apache so I can continue bringing you more heartfelt stories of love, survival, and the fire that remembers.